There are moments in my courtroom that defy the sterile, predictable nature of legal procedure. Most days, the air is filled with the noise of bickering, the hollow ring of rehearsed excuses, and the desperate attempts of people to weave a narrative that serves their bank account rather than the truth. I have sat on this bench for decades, and I have developed a singular, almost instinctual way of sensing the truth before a single witness is sworn in. It starts with the silence. The morning the trial began, the courtroom felt heavier than usual. The defendant, a woman named Julianna Vane, sat at the defense table with the kind of posture that screams privilege. She was impeccably dressed, her hair a masterpiece of expensive maintenance, and her demeanor was one of cold, calculated boredom. She didn't look like a woman accused of systematic exploitation. She looked like someone who had never heard the word no in her life. She was polished, composed, and absolutely convinced that her financial superiority acted as a suit of armor against the law. Opposite her sat Elias Thorne. He was 84, a retired infantry sergeant whose back had bowed over the years from carrying things not just equipment, but the weight of a life lived in service to a country that now seemed to have forgotten him. He moved with a deliberate, agonizing slowness. One hand gripped the handle of a cane that looked like it had seen better decades, and the other clutched a leather-bound folder. It wasn't a briefcase. It was an heirloom of sorts, corners frayed. The leather cracked like dry riverbeds. The defendant didn't even glance at him. She was busy checking her phone, a small, arrogant smirk playing on her lips. She had likely convinced herself that this was a formality, a nuisance she could pay to make disappear. When the clerk announced the proceedings, Elias stood up to approach the stand. His uniform jacket, pulled from a closet long ago, hung loosely on his thin frame. It was clean, pressed with a sharp edge that spoke of a lifetime of military discipline, even if the fabric was fraying at the cuffs. I watched him carefully. I wasn't just looking at the plaintiff, I was watching the defendant's reaction. When Elias reached the stand, he fumbled slightly with his folder. A ripple of impatient murmurs went through Julianna Vane's entourage in the gallery. One of her associates actually sighed a sharp, dismissive sound that cut through the silence. Elias looked at them, then back at me. His eyes were not filled with anger, but with a quiet, devastating exhaustion. The case before me was ostensibly about a fraudulent home repair scheme, a predatory contract signed by an elderly veteran who lived alone. Julianna Vane claimed it was a standard agreement, fully disclosed, signed by a man who had simply changed his mind. But as I looked at Elias Thorne, at the way his knuckles turned white as he held that folder, I knew this wasn't about a contract. This was about a predator who had chosen a target, believing the age and isolation of a soldier made him easy prey. The trial had barely begun, but the atmosphere was already charged with the scent of an impending collapse. The defense attorney didn't start with facts. He started with a scalpel. He stood up, adjusting his silk tie, a small, unnecessary gesture of status, and turned his attention to Elias. His voice was smooth, engineered to sound reasonable, while being inherently dismissive. This is the tactic I have seen 1,000 times, a strategy that relies on the assumption that a court will favor the polished over the worn. He wasn't looking for the truth. He was looking for cracks. He was building a wall between the witness and the court, a wall of doubt that he hoped would obscure the reality of the situation. "Mr. Thorne," he began, his tone dripping with a faux kindness that only an expensive education can teach, "you have had a very long life, a life filled with, let's call them, taxing experiences." He paused, letting the implication hang in the air. He was planting the seed. Age equals infirmity, and infirmity equals unreliability. He asked about Elias's living situation, his medical history, and his medication regimen. Each question was a needle prick, designed to draw blood from the veteran's dignity. He wanted to make it appear that Elias was confused, that his memory was a mosaic of half-remembered fragments, rather than a coherent record of events. Elias remained unmoved. His hands, though trembling slightly, never left the folder. He didn't fall for the trap of getting defensive, nor did he lash out in anger. He simply answered, "I know what I signed, sir, and I know what was promised." The defendant, Julianna Vane, was watching this with a smug satisfaction. She leaned back, tapping her manicured nails on the table, clearly pleased with her lawyer's performance. It was a display of privilege that I found deeply offensive. To them, Elias wasn't a human being. He was a liability to be managed, an inconvenience that could be erased by casting doubt on his mind. But I was watching something else. I was watching the way Elias looked at the defense lawyer, not with confusion, but with the weary patience of a man who had faced true threats, not just legal ones. The defense's narrative was becoming clear. Treat the plaintiff as a senile nuisance. It is a common, cowardly approach, often used when the truth is too difficult to dismantle through honest debate. But what they didn't realize was that they were not just questioning a memory, they were antagonizing a man who had nothing left to lose except his truth. And a man with nothing to lose is the most dangerous witness in any courtroom. I watched Elias tighten his grip on that worn folder. He wasn't just holding paper, he was holding the only record of a promise that had been broken, and the defense had just made the mistake of trying to make him feel ashamed for holding on to it. The room grew colder, and I knew that the defendant's display of arrogance had pushed the case toward a point of no return. The defense attorney, confident in his own perceived cleverness, made a critical mistake. He completely underestimated the resilience of a man who had survived far worse than a courtroom cross-examination. He continued to probe, his eyes darting around the room, searching for a tremor in Elias's voice, a lapse in his timeline, anything he could use to label him unreliable for the record. He was relentless, his questions designed not to uncover the truth, but to systematically dismantle the veteran's credibility, brick by brick. He wanted to make Elias look small, confused, and fragile in front of the court. "Mr. Thorne," the attorney pushed, his voice rising in volume to create a false sense of urgency, "are you telling this court that you, a man who has managed his own affairs for over 8 decades, suddenly lost all capacity for judgment? Are you claiming that you, a veteran who served in foreign lands and handled complex logistics, were incapable of reading a simple standard contract?" The attorney's tone was patronizing, a tactic intended to provoke Elias into a defensive, erratic outburst. He wanted a confused old man, and he was clearly frustrated that Elias remained calm. The courtroom was silent, suspended in the tension. Elias didn't flinch, he didn't stutter, and he didn't offer the defense the angry reaction they were fishing for. He simply looked at the attorney, his gaze steady, clear, and utterly unclouded by the age the defense was trying to weaponize against him. "I am telling you," Elias said, his voice echoing in the quiet chamber with a resonance that demanded total attention, "that I am a man who trusts a handshake. I am a man who believes that when someone offers help to an old soldier, they mean it. I am not senile, counselor. I am just disappointed that I was wrong about what kind of person would look at a veteran and see only a target." That was the moment the energy in the room shifted entirely. You could feel the air pressure drop. It wasn't a roar from the gallery. It was a sudden, collective intake of breath. The defense attorney recoiled, momentarily stunned by the sheer weight of the veteran's dignity. He had expected a confused, rambling antique, but he was staring into the eyes of a man who knew exactly what had happened and who wasn't afraid to state it clearly. I leaned forward, resting my chin on my hand, my eyes locked on the proceedings. I don't tolerate bullying in my courtroom, and the defense attorney was dancing on the edge of my patience. "Counselor," I said, my voice sharp and cutting through the tension like a blade, "the witness has answered your question. Move on or sit down. We are here to find the truth, not to see how many times you can repeat the same insulting line of questioning." The attorney flushed, a spot of deep, embarrassed red blooming on his neck. He tried to pivot, his hands shuffling papers in a panicked display of inefficiency, but the momentum was gone. Elias then began to tell his story, the real one. He didn't speak in legal jargon or complex timelines. He spoke of the day Julianna Vane showed up at his door. He described the brochure she carried, the badge she wore, the way she spoke to him with a warmth that felt like a long overdue favor after years of solitude. She hadn't just taken his money. She had performed a role, acting the part of a savior for a lonely, grieving widower who had been looking for a reason to trust the world again. As he spoke, I watched Julianna. The smug, arrogant smirk was fading, replaced by a twitch at the corner of her mouth. She wasn't checking her phone anymore. She was watching him, not with guilt, but with a growing, sharp irritation. She was annoyed not because she felt sorry for what she had done, but because he was capable of articulating the deception so clearly. She had counted on him to be a confused, broken mess, but instead, she was faced with a witness whose clarity was sharper than the legal arguments she was paying thousands of dollars for. The trial was no longer a formality for her. It was becoming a dissection of her character, and she clearly didn't like the look of the blade. The defense attorney, sensing a shift in the room's momentum, decided to double down on the unreliable witness angle. He wasn't just questioning Elias anymore. He was attacking his cognitive capacity, hoping that if he buried the veteran under enough legal jargon and rapid-fire dates, the man would eventually falter. It is a cowardly strategy, one I have seen used by those who know their case is built on sand. He waved a stack of papers, his voice adopting that forced, condescending patience reserved for the elderly. "Mr. Thorne, let's be precise. You claim Miss Vane promised a full roof replacement for this donation, but the contract which you signed clearly lists it as a non-refundable contribution to homeowner outreach. Do you often sign documents without understanding the difference between a service contract and a charitable gift?" Elias didn't look at the lawyer. He looked at the folder. For the first time, I saw the true weight of what he was carrying. His hands, marked by the topography of a long and difficult life, shook not with the weakness of age, but with the controlled rage of a man holding back a storm. "I didn't sign a gift," Elias said, his voice quiet, steady, and terrifyingly clear. "I signed a promise. She told me the roof would be fixed before the first snow. She told me my wife's roses would be safe." The defendant, Julianna Vane, let out a sharp, dismissive laugh. That laugh was a mistake. In my courtroom, silence is a tool, but laughter is a confession of character. I leaned forward, my gaze locking onto hers until the smirk evaporated from her face. "I have a zero-tolerance policy for disrespect, and there is no one I despise more than a predator who thinks they are the smartest person in the room. Miss Vane," I said, my voice dropping to that register that usually signals the end of a good day for a lawyer, "I suggest you remind your client that this is not a social hour. It is a court of law. One more outburst, and I will have you removed." She went pale, the bravado slipping for the first time. Elias began to open his folder. It wasn't a frantic motion. He moved with a precision that bordered on the ritualistic, as if he were laying out maps for an operation. He produced 3 documents, a handwritten contract, a bank withdrawal slip, and a photograph of his house. The photograph was tucked away, shielded from the harsh light of the room until that very moment. He placed it on the table. It showed a small, modest home, the kind of place that represents a life of work, not a life of wealth. The porch was sagging, and an American flag hung with a deliberate, haunting stillness beside the front door. "This is the house," Elias said, pointing to the photo. "And this is the money." He laid out the bank slip. It was his savings. All of it. She told me that as a veteran I was part of a priority program. She had brochures, she had a badge, she had the uniform of someone who was here to help. I didn't sign a gift. I signed away the last of my protection against the winter. The defense attorney tried to interrupt, citing the technicality of the document, but the room had already moved past his technicalities. Every person sitting in that gallery was looking at that bank slip. They were looking at a man who had sacrificed his youth for his country, only to be picked clean by a woman who looked at his grief and saw an opportunity for profit. I watched Julianna Vane. She wasn't looking at the papers. She was looking at the exits. The architecture of her deception, the brochures, the badge, the professional smile was beginning to collapse under the crushing weight of the veteran's simple, undeniable truth. And I knew, as I stared down at the evidence, that we were only just beginning to pull the thread. The moment Julianna Vane's composure fractured, it didn't happen with a scream. It happened with a sneer, a visible, ugly curl of the lip that she thought she could hide. But I saw it. The defense attorney was mid-sentence, trying to twist Elias's account of the repair contract into something nefarious when Julianna leaned over. She whispered something to her counsel that was loud enough for the microphone to pick up. "Why are we wasting time on this rambling, senile charity case? It's pathetic." The courtroom didn't just go silent. The air left the room. It was the sound of a predator finally showing its teeth. Elias Thorne stopped mid-sentence. He didn't explode. He didn't shout. He simply froze, his shoulders slumping just a fraction of an inch as the weight of her words hit him. That was the moment I decided this woman wasn't just guilty of fraud. She was a bully who fed on the weakness of others. Her arrogance had reached its zenith. She wasn't just fighting a legal battle. She was actively degrading a man who had stood on the front lines while she was likely still in a playpen. I didn't wait for her attorney to apologize. I didn't wait for the court reporter to mark the record. I slammed my gavel down not once, but twice. The sound cracked through the room like a gunshot. Julianna jumped, her eyes wide as she realized the room was staring at her, not with the deference she expected, but with pure, unadulterated contempt. "Miss Vane," I said, my voice dangerously low. In this courtroom, you are not a CEO, you are not a socialite, you are a defendant, and you will treat the men and women who stand in this witness box with the respect they deserve, or I will have you removed from these proceedings and held in contempt. Do I make myself clear? She stuttered, trying to retreat into a mask of innocence. Your Honor, I was just— You were disrespectful, I interrupted, cutting her off. You were arrogant, and you were wrong. If you think your wealth gives you the right to belittle someone whose service to this country has earned him a place in this courtroom that you clearly don't deserve, you are in for a very rude awakening. The gallery erupted in a murmur of approval. It was the arrogance peak I had been waiting for, that singular moment where the defendant's ego finally outpaces their judgment. She had laid her character bare for everyone to see. She didn't fear the truth. She feared that the truth would interfere with her life. She looked around the room, sensing the tide turning. Her attorney was frantic now, scribbling notes, whispering to her, trying to put the genie back in the bottle, but it was too late. The jury in the court had seen exactly who she was. The narrative of the misunderstood businesswoman was dead. Now, we were firmly in the territory of a character judgment that she could not pay her way out of. The tension in the room was electric. Everyone knew that the next piece of evidence wouldn't just be a document, it would be the nail in the coffin. The gavel hadn't even stopped vibrating on the bench before Julianna Vane realized the game had changed. The arrogance that had coated her like a second skin was beginning to peel away, replaced by the frantic, sweat-beading panic of someone who realizes they have walked into a trap of their own making. She looked at her attorney, but for the first time, he didn't have the answers. He was reading the room, and the room was no longer on their side. Mr. Thorne, I said, my voice softer now, but with an intensity that held the entire room hostage. You mentioned you had one more piece of evidence. This is your court, sir. Please proceed. Elias stood. He didn't look at the defense table. He looked at me. His hands were shaking again, but there was a terrifying, quiet resolve in his eyes, the kind of resolve that only comes when a man has decided that the truth is worth the price of his own fear. May I show the court something, Your Honor? He asked, his voice cracking just enough to remind us all of the human cost of this trial. The defense attorney leaped from his chair, his instinct for obstruction kicking in like a reflex. Your Honor, we object. Unless this material was properly disclosed, it is entirely inadmissible, and— Sit down, I cut him off, my voice booming with a finality that made the court reporter pause mid-stroke. I decide what this court sees, not you, and certainly not her. I gestured to Julianna, who was now clutching her purse like a life preserver. Proceed, Mr. Thorne. The room fell into a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight. Elias took a long breath, and with fingers that betrayed the age of his soul, he began to unbutton his left cuff. It was a slow, deliberate movement. Julianna Vane leaned forward, her composure fully shattered now. She knew. She didn't know what he had, but she knew that the secret she thought she had buried in the darkness of his home was about to be dragged into the light. He rolled the sleeve up. First, it was the yellowing, sickly bruising, the distinct, undeniable pattern of fingertips digging into frail skin. The gallery gasped, a collective, sharp intake of breath that sounded like a collective heartbreak. But then, as he rolled it higher, the real evidence came into view. Scrawled in faded, permanent black marker against his forearm were numbers and letters, a date, a time, 9:14 p.m., and beneath that, a name, Julianna Vane. The courtroom was dead silent. I looked at Elias, then at the writing on his skin. It wasn't just a mark, it was a testament. It was a diary of terror written by a man who was so afraid of being gaslit by a predator that he had used his own body as the ultimate witness. He didn't look at me for sympathy, he looked at me for justice. The sight of it was chilling, a physical record of intimidation that made the defense's entire argument about misunderstanding look like the transparent, malicious lie that it was. The shift in the room was absolute. The victim had become the prosecutor, and he had come armed with the one thing the defendant couldn't refute, his own wounded reality. The air in the courtroom had shifted from curiosity to a collective, simmering rage. Julianna Vane, once the image of composed entitlement, now sat shrunken in her chair, her eyes darting between her attorney and the exit, as if calculating the velocity required to escape the consequences of her own vanity. She was no longer looking at the bench with defiance. She was looking at the reality of a prison cell, or perhaps something even more terrifying, the total erasure of the persona she had spent years carefully curating. I didn't need to ask another question. The clerk had already returned with the documents I'd requested during the recess. I opened the folder, my eyes scanning the reality of the situation, the registration records, the bank logs, the list of names. It was all there, spelled out in cold, hard, damning ink. It wasn't just Elias Thorne. There were 6 other men, 6 other widowers, all over the age of 75, all living alone, all targeted with the exact same predatory blueprint. I looked over the rim of my glasses at the defense table. The attorney, once so eager to paint Elias as a confused, senile old man, was now deathly pale. He knew, as any halfway competent lawyer would, that the tide hadn't just turned, it had swallowed his client whole. "Miss Vane," I began, my voice clear and measured, stripped of any patience. "You told this court that this was a donation. You told us that Mr. Thorne was confused about the nature of the transaction. But these documents tell a very different story. They tell the story of a system designed to exploit the very people who built this country while you sat in a designer suit, counting the change from a grieving man's savings account." Her attorney tried to interject, a stammering, weak attempt to object to the characterization, but I silenced him with a single, sharp gesture. "Save it, counselor. We aren't here for your creative writing exercises." I then turned my attention back to the screen, where the clerk had pulled up the final piece of evidence, the doorbell camera footage. The grain was gone, enhanced, clear enough to see the predatory movement in her body language. The audio, played back for the gallery, was crisp. Her threat, "If you go to court, Elias, I will make sure they know you are losing your mind," reverberated against the walls. It was the sound of a bully losing control. The gallery erupted. It wasn't the kind of reaction that gets you cleared from a courtroom. It was a guttural, visceral sound of communal disgust. Julianna looked at the screen, and for the first time, she looked afraid. Not the performance of fear she had likely rehearsed for the judge, but the raw, unfiltered terror of someone who realizes that their name, their privilege, and their money cannot save them from the truth. The court was no longer a stage for her manipulations. It had become a mirror reflecting her own darkness back at her, and she was terrified of the image. The verdict, when it finally arrived, was not just a legal formality, it was a moral reclamation. I looked at Julianna Vane, who was no longer the picture of composed arrogance, but a woman watching her carefully constructed facade disintegrate in real time. I awarded Mr. Thorne the full amount of his stolen savings, but I didn't stop there. I added significant punitive damages, a message from this court that exploiting the vulnerable is a debt that incurs high interest, and that the cost of such cruelty should be prohibitively expensive. But the money, as I have always said in these decades on the bench, is the least interesting part of justice. The real victory was in the courtroom itself. Elias Thorne stood up, his hand finally releasing the folder, his back straighter than it had been all morning. He didn't gloat. He didn't shout. He simply adjusted his jacket and looked toward the back of the room, perhaps toward a memory of the wife who had taught him that some things are worth standing up for, no matter the personal cost. As he walked out, he looked like a soldier again, not a victim, not a confused old man. He was a man who had looked a predator in the eye and refused to blink. He had carried the truth in his pocket, and in the end, that truth had been heavier than any lie the defense could manufacture. I want you to remember this case. The world is full of people who think they can buy silence. They think that if they intimidate you, if they gaslight you, if they make you feel small, you will simply fade away. They are dead wrong. When you have the truth, you have a weapon that no amount of money or legal posturing can blunt. Sometimes, justice isn't just found in a law book. It is found in the stubborn, quiet courage of a person who refuses to let their dignity be stolen. Predators, those who hide behind spreadsheets, fake charities, and confident, practiced smiles, will always underestimate the human spirit. They look for the easy mark, the person who grieves alone, the person who they think has been silenced by age. But when that person stands up, when they finally roll up their sleeves and show the world their scars, the power dynamic shifts instantly. Next time you see someone in a position of power acting as if the world is theirs to command, remember this day. Remember the man who came into my courtroom with a cane and left with his pride fully restored. Justice doesn't care about your surname, your bank account, or your ability to intimidate. Justice cares about the truth, and sometimes it just takes one brave soul to make that truth impossible to ignore. Court is adjourned.